August 17th, 1944. A farmhouse outside Falaise, Normandy. Generalmajor Rudolf Christoph Freiherr von Gersdorf, Chief of Staff of the 7th Army, spread a captured American supply manifest across a table covered in cigarette burns and leaned over it the way a surgeon leans over an X-ray that has just told him something he was not prepared to hear. By every operational principle Gersdorf had absorbed at Kriegsakademie, by every logistics doctrine the Wehrmacht had proven in Poland, in France, in the opening thunder of Barbarossa, a fighting force under the kind of pressure the 7th Army was now applying should be consuming itself from the inside. Supply lines should be fraying, rations should be shrinking, men should be choosing between ammunition and food. Instead, the American soldiers pressing against the Falaise pocket were eating hot meals, not ration tins, not hardtack, hot food, delivered to the front in insulated containers, with enough left over to offer seconds. If that line makes you want to understand what it actually meant, what it revealed about the structural gap between two armies that no tank count or aircraft comparison could explain, then stay with me. If this story moves you, a like helps it reach others who care about these men. And if you're new here, subscribe. What Gersdorf was holding was not just a supply list, it was a confession, a document that accidentally described, in columns of canned goods and caloric projections, why the German army that had rolled over Europe in 18 months was now being systematically destroyed by an opponent its own doctrine had categorized as logistically inferior. This video is the explanation of that document and of the philosophy that produced it. To understand what Gersdorf saw, you have to go back to what the German army believed, not what it practiced imperfectly, what it believed structurally as an article of faith refined through a century of Prussian military philosophy. The Wehrmacht fed its soldiers on the Eiserner Portionssatz, the iron ration, a concept that was philosophically indistinguishable from the army's entire operational worldview. The iron ration was emergency nutrition. It was the minimum a man needed to continue functioning as a weapons platform. It was not designed to sustain him. It was designed to postpone his collapse long enough for the operation to succeed. The assumption underneath the iron ration was not callousness, it was a bet. The German General Staff believed that wars were won in days, not months. Blitzkrieg was not just a tactic, it was a nutritional philosophy. If the campaign lasts 72 hours, your men do not need hot food, they need to be moving. And it had worked. In 1940, the Wehrmacht swept through France in 46 days. German soldiers moving that fast did not have time to sit down for a meal. The logistics tail that fed a conventional army was a weight the Blitzkrieg machine deliberately shed. But that is only the first layer of what the Americans had built. The food was not the answer. The food was the symptom. The answer was buried 3 levels deeper in an organizational philosophy that the German army could see and could not copy. We will get there, but first, hold a name. Staff Sergeant Paul Haussmann, formerly of Allentown, Pennsylvania, formerly the assistant manager of a Woolworth's lunch counter on Hamilton Street, who in 1942 was assigned to the 1st Infantry Division's field kitchen and was given a problem that no Woolworth's customer had ever handed him. The German army that crossed the Meuse in 1940 was not a hungry army. The Wehrmacht Logistics Corps in the early war years was capable, professional, and deeply respected within the institution. German supply officers were trained with the same intellectual seriousness as line officers. The system worked, at the scales it was designed for, against the timelines it was designed to operate within. It was close to flawless. The failure was not in the system's execution. The failure was in what the system was designed to assume. It assumed short wars. It assumed enemy collapse. It assumed that the logistical problem of feeding men in sustained combat was a problem it would rarely face. When France collapsed in 6 weeks, that assumption felt like proof.
It was actually a trap. By the winter of 1941, German soldiers outside Moscow were receiving roughly 1,800 calories per day. American military dietitians studying captured German field records after the war, particularly the Heeresgruppe Mitte supply logs examined by the U.S. Army Quartermaster School at Fort Lee in 1947, calculated that a soldier in sustained winter combat required a minimum of 3,600. The German army was fielding men at half fuel, and the command structure's response, documented in the War Diary of Army Group Center's logistics officer, Oberst Hans von Greifenberg, was not to redesign the system. It was to instruct divisional commanders to exploit locally available resources, which is the military's way of saying your men should find something to eat. The Americans had chosen differently, not because American generals were kinder men, but because American military planners in 1941 and 1942 had looked at a specific problem and made a structural bet that ran directly against the dominant European military tradition. The bet was this: a well-fed soldier is not merely a more comfortable soldier, he is a structurally different weapons system. His decision-making under stress is different. His aggression in the assault phase is different. His ability to function after 72 hours of continuous combat is different. And the man who made the formal case for this, the man who pushed the argument through a skeptical War Department and lived to see it validated in Normandy, was Brigadier General Robert Littlejohn, the chief quartermaster of the European Theater of Operations. Littlejohn was not a combat officer. He had never commanded men in a firefight. He had spent the 1930s thinking about food, in what he had concluded, what he would force the United States Army to accept before a single American soldier set foot in Europe would be described by a German logistics analyst in 1953 as the most consequential single decision of the entire Western campaign. Robert Littlejohn arrived in London in June of 1942 with a problem that military planners rarely discuss and history books almost never record. The United States Army did not know how to feed men in combat, not in theory, in practice, at scale, under fire, moving. The American military had not fought a sustained ground campaign since 1918. Its institutional memory of field feeding had calcified into manuals written for static trench warfare on the Western Front, a context so different from mobile operations in 1944 that the gap between doctrine and reality was almost comical. Littlejohn read those manuals, visited the training camps where American soldiers were eating them into practice, and wrote a memo in October of 1942 that the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps archives still hold. The memo's title was bureaucratic. Its content was a controlled detonation. He wrote, "The belief that combat soldiers will eat what they are given and be grateful for it is not a military philosophy. It is a management failure dressed as stoicism." Littlejohn's position, which he had to fight for in memoranda, in budget hearings, in face-to-face arguments with senior officers who thought feeding soldiers was a logistical afterthought, was that the entire American approach to field nutrition had been built on a false premise. The premise was that soldiers in combat could be fed on whatever was available because combat was temporary, and when it was over, they would recover. Littlejohn said that was wrong. He cited data from the U.S. Army's own performance studies from the North Africa campaign, where American soldiers in the Kasserine Pass in February of 1943 had been operating on reduced rations for 11 days. The performance collapse he documented was not about morale, it was cognitive. Soldiers made worse decisions. Small unit leaders, corporals, sergeants, the men on whom the American tactical system depended, slowed.
Was not an impressive piece of equipment by any aesthetic measure. It was a cylindrical metal vessel, roughly 14 inches tall, with a double-walled construction packed with insulating material. It had a hinged lid that latched from the outside. It weighed 11 pounds empty. Loaded with food, it weighed closer to 30. It was designed to be carried by 2 men, one handle on each end, through whatever terrain existed between the company kitchen and the forward fighting positions. It could hold enough hot food for 35 men, and it could keep that food at a safe serving temperature for 4 hours in ambient conditions that included rain, wind, and temperatures in the low 40s. What it represented was a bet that the U.S. Army was willing to divert 2 men per squad every single day from potential combat duties. In the Wehrmacht, this was incomprehensible, not because German officers were indifferent to their men's welfare, but because the arithmetic felt wrong. 2 men pulling a 30-pound container through active fire zones represented a combat inefficiency the German doctrine could not accommodate. Every man was a weapon. Every weapon had to be pointed at the enemy. The idea that you would take weapons out of the line to carry lunch violated the first principle of combat economy. The question was not, what is the cost of feeding men hot food? The question was, what is the cost of not feeding them? And that cost, Littlejohn argued, with figures drawn from the medical department's combat fatigue studies in the infantry school's small unit performance assessments, was invisible in a single day and catastrophic over a week. A man running on iron ration for 72 hours was not a man at 90% capacity. He was a man at 60% capacity who believed he was at 90. That gap between perceived performance and actual performance was precisely where small units broke down. Staff Sergeant Paul Hausman understood this in a different language. He had not read Littlejohn's memos, he had watched men eat. Hausman had managed the Woolworth's lunch counter on Hamilton Street in Allentown for 3 years before he was drafted in October of 1942. He knew what a man looked like when he sat down hungry and what he looked like 30 minutes later. He knew, with the empirical certainty of someone who had served 10,000 lunches, that food did not just feed the body. It marked a boundary. It said, this part of the day is over. The next part begins now. Hot food, specifically, was a ritual as much as a calorie. It was a claim the Army made in behalf of the soldier. You matter enough to feed properly. That is the second layer, and it is the one the German system was structurally incapable of replicating, even if its commanders had wanted to. But there is a third layer still, the one that actually appears in the German after-action reports, the one that made officers like Gersdorf reach for the word that German military culture reserved for things it could not explain. They called it Kampfmoral, fighting spirit, the thing you were supposed to build through ideology, through discipline, through the shared identity of the Volk in arms. The 1st Infantry Division landed at Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, and within 72 hours was fighting through the hedgerows of the Norman countryside in conditions that reduced every clean line on every tactical map to a fiction. The bocage, the dense network of earthen hedgerows that divided Normandy into thousands of small compartments, was a terrain that nullified artillery, armor, and air support simultaneously. Every field was a fortress, every lane was a kill zone, every hedgerow concealed a German machine gun position that had been prepared for months and could not be seen until you were close enough for it to kill you. In these conditions, the American squad, 8 to 12 men, a sergeant, lifes, a light machine gun, was the unit that mattered, not the division, not the regiment, not even the battalion. This sounds trivial. It was not. The after-action reports of the 352nd Infantry Division, filed on July 3, 1944, and captured intact when the division's headquarters was overrun outside St. Lo, contained a passage that the U.S. Army's Military Intelligence Service translated and circulated to senior commanders within 2 weeks of its capture. The reporting officer, Oberstleutnant Ernst Heine, the division's operations officer, was attempting to explain something his patrol debriefings kept returning to. American soldiers who were captured, he wrote, consistently reported having eaten within the previous 4 hours. Not all of them, not most of them, essentially all of them. Heine wrote, the prisoner population does not present with the nutritional stress indicators we observe in comparable German formations under equal operational tempo. He knew what the operational tempo was. He was living it.
His own men were receiving one hot meal every 36 to 48 hours, supplemented by the Panzerschokolade, the amphetamine-laced combat chocolate that the Wehrmacht had been issuing since 1940 to keep soldiers functional past the point of human endurance. Heine's men were being chemically held together, and across the hedgerows, American soldiers were eating hot beef stew. Consider what that required from Heine's perspective. You are an operations officer, trained in a tradition that views logistics as the servant of tactics. Tactics determine what must happen, logistics determine how to support it. The priority order is fixed. Now you are looking at an enemy that appears to have inverted the priority order, that appears to be allowing logistical considerations to shape tactical decisions. American units, Heine noted, would sometimes delay a patrol by 30 minutes to allow the Marmite cans to arrive. 30 minutes. In the bocage, 30 minutes was the difference between catching a German position before its relief arrived and walking into a prepared defense, and the Americans were spending that 30 minutes eating. What Heine could not access, what his training had not prepared him to ask, was the question the American regimental commanders were asking. Not, can the patrol go now, but will the patrol perform better if it goes now or after the men have eaten? That question could only be asked inside a command philosophy that viewed the soldier's physical state as a tactical variable. German doctrine did not view it that way. German doctrine viewed the soldier's physical state as his personal responsibility, endurable by will, managed by ideology, irrelevant to the operational plan. Heine could see the Marmite cans. He could not access the philosophy that had produced them, because that philosophy was invisible inside his own doctrinal framework. His framework literally did not have a category for it. This was not a secret. It was not an intelligence gap. It was a conceptual blind spot so complete that the information itself was meaningless. Paul Hausmann, the former Woolworth's lunch counterman, had become, by the summer of 1944, the first sergeant of a company kitchen in the 1st Division that was feeding 212 men in combat positions spread across roughly 3 kilometers of front. He had solved the Marmite can problem the way he had solved the lunch rush on Hamilton Street, by working backwards from the eating, not forward from the cooking. In Hamilton Street, the question was, when do people arrive? You build the schedule around the arrival. In the bocage, the question was, when can the runners reach the line? You build the cooking schedule around the runners, not the other way around. Not food ready when the kitchen was ready, food ready when the men could receive it. That inversion, building the system around the end point rather than the starting point, is the second layer's deepest truth. But there is a third layer that explains why the Germans could not adopt it even after they understood it, and it starts not with food, but with rank. If this is the kind of history you have been looking for, the structural story inside the headline story, subscribe and hit the bell. There is more of this coming. The German Army's failure to replicate the American nutritional system was not a logistics failure, it was a philosophical one. And the philosophy in question was ancient, structural, and by 1944, lethal. The Wehrmacht's relationship to its enlisted men was built on a concept that had no clean English translation, but that the historian Omer Bartov, in his 1991 study, Hitler's Army, documented through the disciplinary records of 3 Eastern Front divisions. The soldier existed to absorb punishment on behalf of the state, not to be preserved, to be expended. This was not ideology, it was operational economics. The Wehrmacht of 1941 was a tactically magnificent force. Its NCOs were among the most capable small unit leaders of the 20th century. Its doctrine of Auftragtaktik, mission-type orders, authority pushed down to the lowest capable level. These are facts, they are not concessions, they are the baseline without which what follows cannot be understood. The failure was not in the men or even in the immediate leadership. Auftragtaktik pushed authority downward in the tactical domain. A German sergeant could make battlefield decisions that would require a staff officer in other armies, but that authority stopped at the body, with the sergeant ate when he slept, how his caloric state affected his decision-making capacity. These were not tactical variables, they were invisible. The chain of command that gave a sergeant the authority to maneuver his squad did not give the sergeant any mechanism to say, "My men have not eaten in 30 hours, and I believe this is affecting our performance." There was no doctrinal vocabulary for that statement. There was no reporting channel. There was no officer above him whose job included asking the question.